Hi, PDA supporters and friends. I'm Bill Bianchi with Progressive Democrats of America, Chicago, and I'm here at the offices of the Chicago Teachers Union, and I'm going to be talking with Kristine Mayle, who is the union's financial secretary and part of the caucus that won leadership of the union several years ago. What a ride it's been. For just in a few years with their new leadership, the CTU has led a successful strike that has really garnered attention not only in this country but around the world. People looking to it as some kind of milestone and perhaps a turnaround in the plight of unions around the world. And at the same time, CTU continues to lead the struggle against school closings, against the expansion of charter schools, against the sort of mindless testing and other issues. Why don't we start with school closings? Can you give us a kind of a brief overview of the current situation in regard to the school closings here in Chicago?
Sure. Right now we're facing what they're calling 54 school closings. It actually affects over 100 schools.
Wow.
In some way, either receiving or turnarounds also in addition to the closings. The original numbers the board put out was that it would affect 30,000 students, and right now we're looking at about 47,000 students that will be affected by this. Some of them they're outright closing, some of them they're consolidating into other schools, and then there's another batch that they added at the end where they're turning around schools, which basically they fire every adult in the building, the kids remain there, and then they bring in new staff.
Wow, so that's pretty massive. Now, as I understand it, many of the closings are in African-American neighborhoods. How did that happen?
Well, this is part of the plan, right? It's gentrification and urban redesign, and so these are the schools that have been starving for years. These are the schools that have been asking for resources and haven't been getting them. Most of them are in African-American and Latino communities. The numbers that we've seen are that 88% of the children that will be affected by school closings are African American, but less than half of the students in the district are African American. So it's a disproportionate amount. It's the neighborhoods that have been struggling.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate for a second here. In the past 10 years, Chicago has lost something like 200,000 residents. I mean, they declined. They moved out. They're not lost. But and presumably a lot of them, a good number of them were African American, and probably a lot of school children are included in that group. So it might seem reasonable to people to think, well, there's more room in the schools now, so maybe it's an efficient thing to do. What do you say to that?
Well, two things. Yes, the city has lost population. The numbers that the board has been using, they've been quoting about 130,000 school-age children in the last 10 years, which is just not true. We have documents from the board that shows that the number is closer to 30,000 students. And then when you take into account the number of charter schools they've opened, it's pretty much an even amount. We really haven't lost that many students. They've just shifted to charter schools.
Okay, so here's a school that's, was built for 1,000 students, now only has 500. But how does that relate to the number of teachers? Why would they have to reduce the number? I mean, they have the right number of teachers for the 500 students, so wouldn't the teachers just move with the students to a new school?
In theory, yes. I mean, that's what our contract states. That's what should happen. I actually got involved in this movement because I was at a so-called underutilized school that got closed down. And so I got to see what it is to work in what they call an underutilized school. And I would say it's actually a well-resourced school. For the first time, you have class sizes that are manageable. You can actually give students the one-on-one attention they need. There's enough supplies for them. And so for them to call it underutilized is ridiculous. If you look at the schools that the mayor sends his kids to, that all of these board members that send their kids to private schools, these are the class sizes that their students have. So my question is, why is it good enough for them but not good enough for the students of Chicago?
What are some of the effects of closing that you've observed on neighborhoods or families? I know they've closed a number of schools over the past 5 or so years. And what are some of the effects that you've seen?
Yeah,
pro and con, if there are.
Under Renaissance 2010, they've closed about 100 schools in the last 10 years. You see destabilization of neighborhoods. You see more gang activity. You see kids having to cross gang lines and put them in dangerous situations. Fenger High School was the site of a turnaround. The year before the murder of the student there, There were teachers at the closing hearing saying, please don't do this because students will die, and 6 months later somebody did. You also see a destabilization of the neighborhood businesses. So the small businesses that all the students run to after school to buy their hot chips and their candy, those stores get shut down because the whole neighborhood just gets vacated. There's no center of the community anymore.
Well, that's discouraging. What about on families in terms of education? Has closing resulted in any improvement in education that is measurable? I mean,
we haven't seen any research to that. The research that I've seen shows that there's an average of 6 months to 1 year of gains lost every time a student transitions to another school. And so these closings are happening in unstable neighborhoods to begin with. These are schools that have really high mobility rates, which is part of the reason why they're not doing as well as other schools in the city. And so you add another factor that affects their mobility, and it hurts the student learning. It takes a while to get acclimated to a new school and new friends and new teachers. And so students actually are losing learning time every time they have to transition.
As far as you know, in the list of schools that are being closed, are there any charter schools that are being closed?
No, the initial list, there were a bunch of charters that were put on that list. They've all been removed, and actually the board is proposing to open 11 new charters this year.
Wow. Why do you think they're trying to do so much so fast? It seems like there's an awful urgency behind this activity.
I think a couple of reasons. One is the good old shock and awe that we've seen people use.
Where did we hear that?
Yeah. Just like Katrina, this is the biggest school closing in the country since Katrina. They used the hurricane and Katrina to close down dozens and dozens of schools. They basically wiped out the entire New Orleans public school system. This is the next largest. And so it's a shock and awe. They think people will get over it quickly. Mayoral elections in a couple years, maybe people will forget by the time that election comes around. And also I hope that the reform movement is on its last breath. People are starting to catch on to what the so-called reform movement is about. And I think maybe they think this is a last-ditch effort because they're not going to get away with it for much longer.
I can see a lot of problems involved with closing schools. What does the union propose that we do about the neighborhood schools to make them less likely to become targets of improvement efforts?
It goes back to what we were talking about before our strike. We published a report about the schools Chicago students deserve. We still stand by that. We still think that that's the real way to get real school improvement. We need additional arts, music, PE classes. We need well-resourced classrooms. We need smaller class sizes. Gimmicks about closing down schools that have too small of class sizes just doesn't make sense. That's the one proven thing that will actually help improve student learning is a small class size, because the teachers can actually interact with all the students.
I see. Final question that I wanted to ask about closing. Is it primarily schools that are whose student bodies are very poor? Are there any examples of more middle class schools that are being closed?
There are a couple up on the north side, but if you look at the map, there's a couple of really great maps. One that overlays the school closures with violence in the city, but then there's also another one that overlays poverty and the closures, and it's a direct correlation. The schools that are in poorer neighborhoods are the ones that are being closed. If you look at the map, there's only 5 schools north of North Avenue that are being targeted. And anybody that's from Chicago realizes that the more wealthy people tend to live up north.
What is the union strategy then for fighting school closing?
Oh wow, we've got a lot going on. There's been in summary, there's been over 150 hearings in just the last couple months.
Wow, that many.
We've been there. We've been turning our members out to there. We've been trying to get the message out to parents about why it's important for them to be there. We have a legislative strategy. We're working right now to try to get a moratorium on all school closures. We need to slow this down, put the brakes on it, and take a real hard look at what we're doing and if it's good for kids. And then we also have some legal strategies that we're pursuing.
But you can't talk about some of the other things that you've mentioned, that I think Karen Lewis has mentioned, registering voters or things like that.
Right. That's more of a long-term kind of effort. We want to register some more voters. We want to activate the space that the mayor has angered and let people realize that there's another way to fight back. That's more long-term. More immediate is we need an elected representative school board.
I was going to ask about that. So
that would stop a lot of these issues. That's why we have to go down to Springfield and ask for a moratorium, because there's nobody here in the city that can help us. And so that's one of our big campaigns coming up. We also have some marches. We had a big march back in March 27th. We have another one coming up May 20th. We're doing a neighborhood canvassing kind of walk, civil rights style, having a group of people leave from the south side, have a group leave from the north side, meet in the middle downtown for a big rally on the 20th of May, just to get the message out there, because people are aware, but I don't think they realize the full implications of what's happening.
Okay. How will you measure success in this battle? It seems so large, and the cards are stacked against you. What are the things you're looking for in terms of successful outcomes?
Obviously, we'd like to get as many schools off the list as possible. How many more aldermen can we get on our side to see that this is the right way? Right now we have a group of about 8 aldermen that have coming out supporting us and realizing that this is going to hurt their communities. If we can get more of the city council behind us, if we can get more of our state reps and state senators behind us, and get parents out. That's the big thing, is getting the community members out there speaking their voices and letting people know that this isn't going to stand. And those are the people that are the voters. So
okay.
it's important.
Let's turn now to one of my favorite topics, and that is charter schools. I've read that there are about 50,000 of CPS's 400,000 plus students are now in charter schools, but the plan is to expand that substantially. Yes. What have you heard?
Yeah, there's a compact. It's the Gates Compact. Bill Gates signed on with the city to open, I believe it's 30 new charters within the next 10 years, or 5 or 10 years. They're already divvied up. Uno gets X amount, Noble Street gets X amount. We've seen the documents to show this. It's silly, because in the wake of closing our schools, saying there's not enough kids to fill our schools, they're promising to open more schools. It just doesn't make any sense.
That's an interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. Logically speaking, I mean, if it were really about the kids and filling these schools, that would be one thing, but that shows that there's another motivation.
And let's talk about that motivation a little bit, but I thought maybe just for a little background, but how exactly does a charter school differ from the regular neighborhood school?
Number one, they're non-union. For the most part, there's a handful of schools that are union right now. Is that by law? It's not by law. It's if we unionize the charters, they can join the CTU, but we would have to negotiate separate contracts for them. So right now, the IFT is working on organizing charter schools, and we hope that someday they'll be part of our union. They work at all the things that are tied to being in a union also affect them. So they work really long hours. They have no job protections. They get public funds, just like our students do, but they also get funds from their donors and from their boards.
So would you say that the average charter school per pupil gets more money than the public school?
Yes, they argue that they don't, but they get the same per pupil that we do, plus whatever their foundations or corporations raise also.
Just to clarify, who actually owns and administers a charter school?
That is an interesting question. It depends on what context you're talking. There was a recent ruling on one of the schools that was trying to organize, saying that they were actually a private employer and not a public employer through the education. But they will also go on the news and say, no, we're public schools. They play both sides.
We need public money, but we want to run it like a private.
Exactly. It's
see.
Whoever's speaking in for what purpose, they shift.
Well, could a for-profit entity, just a plain, like a business, own a charter school that is funded by it?
Sure.
Do any?
They're working on it. There's a group called K-12 that's coming into the state.
Oh, that's the virtual.
Yeah, virtual charters, and they're invading downstate right now, and they're trying to get their hooks in up in Chicago, but they haven't been successful yet.
Now, is there a cap on administrator salaries in can they pay the administrator of a charter school anything they want to?
Yes, and they seem to be. Juan Rangel from UNO makes $250,000 a year, which is more than the administrators for all of CPS. So he's got a handful of schools under his charge, and he makes as much as the leaders of the Chicago Public Schools, which have 600 plus schools.
So he could make $1 million if they wanted to?
Sure, if they were willing to pay.
Wow. I've heard from an outside source that K-12, which is this group that is trying to start virtual charter schools in Illinois, that is, they'd have no brick and mortar building, they would just work over the internet, that they have been involved in, and they're working very hard at that, they've been involved in several scandals over fudge test scores. What do you know about K-12?
Yeah, I mean, that's the extent I know about K-12. They've gotten into trouble in different states across the country. It seems like they pick up shop and move when something breaks out there. There's also the Gulen movement that we've had problems with CMSA, the Chicago Math and Science Academy. They've had scandals following them. UNO has obviously had a ton of scandal following them. Just this morning there was another story about kickbacks for construction loans related to people that worked on the UNO board and also got state money for it. So there's a lot of scandal, and that's part of the problem. It's an unregulated industry when they're using that private hat, but when it's public, it's...
So to take it off, public, private, public.
Exactly.
Well, what about performance? How do charters and neighborhood schools measure up when it comes to educational outcomes?
The most conclusive study there is the Credo study out of Stanford. It's a few years old now, but it basically shows that there's no difference. The majority of charters perform the same or not as well as public schools. There's a small handful that do it better, but it's a very small number.
So why do you think the board is so gung-ho for opening charter schools?
We're in Chicago, right? We privatize our parking meters, we privatize everything. Schools are pretty much the last bastion for them to privatize. So
I see. Do you see any conditions under which the union would be okay with charter schools?
If they're unionized employees and they're actually serving a purpose and helping students, they have certified teachers in their classrooms, and they're doing things the right way, I think we'd be okay with it. I mean, we're working right now to organize the UNO workers. We've seen a huge outcry from their workers. When we reached out to them, they've welcomed us with open arms. If we can start correcting some of the ills of charter schools by unionizing their workers, I think we'd be okay with it. The problem is they're coming in and they're taking our students and they're taking our jobs, and they're not doing anything better for the kids. If they were actually helping kids and doing things in a new, innovative way, the way that they were intended to be, I think we'd be much more okay with it. But instead we've seen scandals and abuse of workers and all sorts of issues that aren't good for kids.
Okay. Thanks. Let's look at a couple of other issues quickly. One is performance pay. Paying teachers. Let me ask, what's wrong with paying teachers for performance?
Students aren't widgets. I mean, just like the neighborhoods that are targeted for school closings, different students come with different issues, and they're not all going to perform at the same level as others. Unstable homes, high mobility rates, higher incidences of special education needs. You can't compare one student to another. There's no fair way to judge how good a teacher is in their classroom. They've tried to devise formulas in different states. We've seen that be disastrous. We've seen state award-winning teachers, like best teacher in the state, we've seen them be downgraded the following year because their student test scores weren't good enough. If there was a real way to measure how teachers were doing, we might be okay with it. But right now they're just using it as a way to get rid of our lanes and steps and their salary schedules that we've fought for decades to obtain.
Okay. And then finally, testing. We've heard over and over that gearing education towards standardized test results is a bad idea educationally. And in Seattle, teachers have actually refused to give the standardized tests. And what is the CTU's position on testing? And do you see the situation where teachers in Chicago might refuse to give tests?
Yeah, we're actually seeing a bunch of students. PSAE testing is happening this week for high school students. The first day is high stakes for them. So they're going to take the test that day, but the second day is pretty much just for data. And so we've heard from groups of students that are planning on boycotting the test this year. We've seen and heard from our members that the testing has gotten out of control. Some kindergartners and first graders are taking up to 14 tests a year. They're quarterly tests that just keep repeating, and so if you keep testing all year, you have no time to teach. You can't get better if you're not teaching. We're seeing a lot less autonomy in our classrooms. We're all certified professionals. All CTU members have degrees and certifications from the state that say that we are eligible to teach and capable of teaching. And the tests are really undermining what we're able to do.
You know, anecdotally, I heard from someone that, well, the whole reason for testing often given is because we're falling behind schools in Finland and Korea. And I read that in Finland, elementary school students receive one test in their whole 6 or 8 years, however long they're in elementary school. That's that one test.
Right.
So it's something to consider that maybe CPS should take into consideration.
Well, and nationwide, it's testing is a $600 billion industry. I mean,
wow.
You look at the numbers, it's pretty clear. Common Core and the textbooks that need to be realigned, educational supplies make up for a ton of money every year. So it's less about
money behind this movement.
Just
you think?
Just a smidgen.
Well, we've heard in the headlines recently that down in Atlanta, a number of teachers and administrators have been arrested for fudging test results.
Yep.
Do you see that happening here in Chicago, or I don't know? Well, I guess what I'm trying to say, there seems to be an incentive. I mean, they're setting up big incentives for people to fudge tests.
Yeah, it beyond just an incentive as in a positive reward for doing something a certain way. People are being threatened with losing their jobs if they don't test a certain way. So this is it's a nationwide issue, and I think Atlanta was just the first one to come up. They've brought up scandal in DC with Michelle Rhee. They're finally investigating her and her testing scandals. I think we're going to see it all over the country. That was just the tip of the iceberg.
Let's talk about the big picture a little bit. It seems that Chicago's become the epicenter for the so-called reform of public education. Why do you think it's here and now? Why do you think this is happening here?
Well, it started here with Renaissance 2010. I think we were the guinea pigs for that one. They saw that it could work in some ways. Arne Duncan was here, and now he's the Secretary of Education. We have huge corporations and foundations that are funding this, the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, that everybody's on the same page. And so the little ideas that they tried here, they're spreading, and they're adapting and changing and finding new ways to get around the things. We defeat something that they come up with, and then they
well, what
adapt.
Is their motivation? What's pushing them to get so involved in education?
I think it all goes back to money again. It really, money and training.
It's a huge business that they want to get into.
It's a huge business, and also from the workforce standpoint, if I'm a big employer, I want mindless drones to work for me. They don't want creative thinkers that will stand up and fight back. They don't want problem solvers. They want drones to work.
Okay. Another thing here in Illinois, after years of working together, Illinois unions and the Democratic Party seem engaged in some pretty bitter conflicts right now. I mean, not just the teachers, but many other unions. How do you think that conflict is going to affect the relationship between the Democrats and the unions, particularly as we go into 2014 and 2016?
Yeah. I think unions are going to be stepping back a little bit further from the Democratic Party. I think we're going to have to actually see some real results. If they want our help and they want our support, they need to stop hurting us. I mean, looking at the education front, the Democrats are hurting us as badly, if not worse, than the Republicans are. The cuts to education, Social Security, our pensions, all of these things that Democrats are supposedly stand for, they've let happen to us. So I think the unions are going to have to really start thinking about where we're investing our time and money, and seeing if this is the way we want to continue going, because it's not working for us right now.
I see a lot of powerful groups coming together against organized labor, Chamber of Commerce and the Koch brothers and all of these foundations. Do you see unions coming together to circle the wagon, so to speak, and try to defend themselves here in Illinois?
I think as part of the educational movement, we've had a lot of support from our brothers and sisters in SEIU and AFSCME and Unite Here. I think we're starting to see that we have more in common than we don't, even though we work in different sectors. So our partnerships on some of our education issues are allowing us to expand on some of the political issues and some of the election kind of issues. And I think we're going to be working more closely with the others.
What can groups like PDA or other activist groups, what do you think we can do to support the struggle to preserve public education and also the rights of workers to organize?
Things like this, talking about it, getting the message out to people. I think a lot of times people hear the little news blips, but they don't actually think about the implications. And I know that's how we were so successful in our strike, is that we gave people the information, gave them a chance to read it and digest it, and then they realized what was actually happening.
An interesting idea. Well, when you think about all that's happened in the past 3 years, what is it that's giving you the most hope so far?
We finally have engaged and active members. For a long time, our members felt hopeless and felt like—
The union members.
Our union members, and also the parents and community members that we deal with. There wasn't much of a fight back. Nobody had really stood up.
Yeah.
We had years of so-called peace with the dailies, and now that Rom's come in and started things with us, we have a bit of a fight. We have people pushing back and opening their eyes and seeing what's really going on, and seeing that it's not just parking meters, it's education, it's healthcare, it's closing our mental health clinics. It's all tied together, and I think there's an awakening in people. The Arab Spring definitely played a part of that, Occupy Chicago and the Occupy movement as a whole. But I think people are starting to wake up and realize that this 1% thing isn't just a slogan, it's a reality. And we have people power. They might have the money, but we have people power.
Okay. Okay then, thank you. This has been a really informative interview, I think, and I've learned some things. And I just want to say this has been Bill Bianchi with Progressive Democrats of America, talking with Kristine Mayle of the Chicago Teachers Union. Thank you, Kristine.
Thank you, Bill.